What if I told you that a major region you can visit right now isn't named after a real historical event, but carries the exact name of King Arthur's greatest domestic rival? Nearly 1 million people live there today, completely unaware that their modern address is directly etched with the legacy of a warlord who nearly brought down Camelot. I'm talking about Lothian, Scotland, named after none other than King Lot, the fierce northern sovereign who led a massive coalition of rebel kings to snatch the crown from a young, unproven King Arthur. Welcome back to the Hidden Roundtable podcast. Pull up a chair, pour a drink, and get comfortable because you are officially tracking with us into episode 6. If you've been with us for the last 5 episodes, you know we love peeling back the layers of history to find where the myths actually bleed into our modern reality. And if you're new here, you picked the perfect time to join the circle. Tonight, we're diving straight into the shadow of the crown. We're looking at the villains, the fierce rivals, and the real-world geographies from Edinburgh to the ancient hill forts that keep the Arthurian legend alive in the 21st century. Let's unearth the truth.
Right. And to unearth that truth, we really have to set some hard ground rules for tonight's investigation right off the bat.
Yeah, definitely. Because the terrain we're heading into is just incredibly dense.
Exactly. So, if you've been tracking with us, you already know the core mission here. We are taking that pristine French Romance armor, the gleaming knights, the magical swords, all of it.
The shiny white castles.
Right, the shining stone castles. We are taking all of that and throwing it straight out the window.
Because it's all just Southern propaganda, honestly.
It absolutely is. It's weaponized folklore. So tonight, we are hunting for the actual gritty, sub-Roman dirt and stone reality of King Loth.
No magical thinking allowed.
None. We are operating exclusively in the 5th and 6th centuries. You have to really visualize the geopolitical landscape here. The Roman legions, they've pulled out.
The central administration has completely collapsed.
Yeah, the structured economy is just gone.
And
what's left is this brutal, terrifying geopolitical sandbox.
full of independent warlords.
Right, the deuces below them. These guys are fighting tooth and nail in the mud. So, I am not accepting poetry tonight.
We want physical receipts.
I am demanding physical receipts. We're looking at archaeology, military logistics, and the geopolitical reality to prove that the core narrative of Arthur's greatest rival belongs strictly in the north.
Specifically with the Votadini tribe.
Exactly. The tribe that eventually becomes the Gododin. If there isn't a physical receipt in the soil, we just aren't buying it.
I really appreciate that framework because, to find a 5th century warlord, you absolutely cannot start in a dusty medieval library.
No, the illuminated manuscripts are useless here.
Completely. We have to start by looking at a modern map of southeastern Scotland.
Yeah.
We have to look at the topography.
The hills, the rivers.
Right, the defensive choke points. And that brings us directly to a concept we touched on in a previous investigation.
The toponymic palimpsest.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's absolutely critical for understanding this specific rival.
It's the bedrock of our whole geographic methodology for this era.
So for you listening, think of a palimpsest like an old piece of parchment. Back in the medieval world, vellum and parchment were just insanely expensive.
You'd just throw them away.
Right. So if a monk wanted to write something new, they'd take a blade, literally scrape the ink off the older text, and just write the new stuff right over it.
But the ghost of the old text is still there.
Exactly. If you hold it up to the light, you can still see those faint traces underneath. And a toponymic palimpsest is that exact same mechanism, but applied to a physical landscape.
The modern map sits on top, with all the modern cities and highways.
But beneath it, that ancient identity of the tribes and warlords is still visible. So when we look for the historical kernel of King Lot, we're looking squarely at your Hen Ogledd.
The Old North.
Right.
And that's because the sub-Roman withdrawal left this terrifying power vacuum in that specific territory.
It wasn't replaced by magical kings instantly.
Not at all. When the Roman scaffolding vanished in the early 400s, it was replaced by panicked, totally pragmatic warlords trying to hold on to territory.
Against some massive external pressures, too.
Oh, massive. You had encroaching Picts swarming down from the highlands.
Scots pushing in from the west.
And early Angles probing the eastern coastlines. Lothian was absolute ground zero for a 3-front war.
It was literally the meat in the sandwich.
Right. Which means whoever held that territory wasn't just some guy with a crown. They were a supreme military commander holding the absolute front line of Britain.
And when we look for the earliest written evidence of the guy who eventually gets warped into King Lot, we don't find him in Mallory's Le Morte d'Arthur.
No, definitely not the French Vulgate cycle either.
We find him in the Vita Cantigrani, which is a Latin hagiography.
A saint's life. Specifically for St. Mungo, the patron saint of Glasgow.
Right. And in those early records, we don't see a King Lot of Orkney. That title is completely non-existent. We see this highly localized guy named Ludonus.
And he is explicitly named as the absolute ruler of Ludonia.
Which is the medieval Latin word for Lothian.
Exactly. And here is where the linguistic forensics really come into play. The name Ludonus is what linguists call an eponymous back formation.
Right, which literally translates to Lothian ruler.
Yeah.
But I'll be honest, I have to push back a little on this naming convention. I hear what you're saying about Lothian ruler, but I have a genuinely hard time buying this level of permanence.
Why is that?
We're talking about the early 5th century. Mass illiteracy is just the absolute norm.
Right. Nobody is reading or writing.
And borders are shifting every single Tuesday based on, like, who has the most spears and who can actually feed their men. You don't just decree, hey, this massive swath of geography is now named after me forever.
You think it wouldn't stick?
I mean, how does it stick for 1,500 years?
Yeah.
It's like a modern mafia boss being so intensely powerful that a whole city district is just permanently renamed the boss's turf.
Right.
How does a single man imprint his name on a landscape so permanently? That requires something way beyond just winning a few border skirmishes.
Well, your skepticism is totally justified. It cuts to the absolute core of how sub-Roman power dynamics actually functioned.
Because monks didn't just invent a name, right?
Exactly. A scribe writing a hagiography centuries later doesn't just pull a name out of thin air, slap it on a map, and successfully convince a whole regional population to use it.
So why did it stick?
It stuck because it was rooted in raw, unadulterated regional power. To imprint your personal identity on a landscape for a millennium and a half, you need absolute, multi-generational military dominance.
You're carving your name into the psychology of the people.
Literally through blood and soil. The memory of his power was just so overwhelming that the people couldn't untangle the man from the land. He basically was the land.
Wow.
And we actually have Welsh genealogical records that cross-reference this sheer military weight. In the ancient Welsh triads, he's known as Ludun Ludawc.
Ludun Ludawc, which translates to Ludun of the host.
Exactly. Of the host, not Ludun the pious or Ludun of the just, Ludun of the massive army.
Anchoring him directly to the Votadini tribe.
Right. The ancient Briton people, recorded by Roman cartographers, who would later evolve into the fiercely martial Gododdin.
Okay, so we have the linguistic ghosts and the Welsh genealogies backing up his military scale. But earlier, you demanded the physical mechanics of this power.
I want physical receipts.
Exactly. You want to know how a warlord actually commands that level of geographic real estate?
We need to look at the architecture of his rule. Where did this man actually stand to project that kind of dominant military muscle across southeastern Scotland?
And that search takes us straight from the ghost on the map to the physical headquarters, the gritty reality of the Old North.
We have to look at Dunpelder.
Dunpelder. It's a Cumbric name.
And it translates to the Fort of the Spear Shafts, right?
Yes. Just visualize that imagery for a second. The Fort of the Spear Shafts.
It's intimidating just saying it. Today, that location is known as Traprain Law, out in East Lothian. And if we're talking about receipts, we have to talk about the geology of this place.
Because the geology is the military strategy. Traprain Law is this massive volcanic laccolith formed of phonolite rock.
Okay, we need to break that down. Throwing around terms like laccolith obscures the tactical reality for someone trying to picture this battlefield.
Fair point. So think of a laccolith like a massive subterranean blister of magma.
Billions of years ago.
Right. This magma pushed up from deep within the earth, trying to erupt, but it didn't quite break the surface.
It just pooled under the crust.
Yeah, and slowly cooled into a colossal plug of diamond hard rock. Then, over millennia, giant glaciers moved across Scotland.
When a glacier hits soft dirt, it carves right through it.
But when a glacier hits a hard volcanic plug like this, it acts like a river heading a massive boulder. It scrapes away the soft earth from the front, leaving a sheer, basically unscalable cliff face.
And as the ice flows over the top, it deposits a gently sloping ramp of protected debris behind it. Geologists call this a crag and tail formation.
Which is just a wild geological anomaly.
And if you are a 5th century warlord, that anomaly is the greatest gift nature could possibly give you.
You aren't building a vulnerable timber palace down in some grassy valley.
No, where anyone can just walk up and burn you out. Absolutely not. You find the most brutal, sheer, defensible rock formation in the region.
And Traprain Law is a natural fortress. It rises hundreds of feet into the air.
You have a sheer drop on 3 sides that no infantry could ever hope to climb.
And just that single, highly defensible ramp leading up to the summit.
From that high ground, you completely control the visual landscape. You can see any advancing army, whether they're marching over the hills or sailing up the Firth of Forth.
From miles away. And the human history that actually took place on top of that rock is just as sheer and unforgiving as the cliffs themselves.
It really is.
If we look at the early hagiography of Lot's family, it strips away all that shiny chivalric romance. It exposes the cartel-like reality of his rule.
Tell them the story of his daughter.
Right, so the Vita Kentigerney says Ludonis has a daughter named Tenu, and he discovers that she is pregnant out of wedlock.
By a prince from a rival kingdom.
Exactly. The man responsible is Owain Mab Urien, a historical prince from the neighboring Brythonic kingdom of Reged.
Which is a massive problem.
Huge. When Ludonis finds out, his reaction isn't a stern talking to. He doesn't banish her to a convent. He orders his own daughter to be dragged to the sheer southern cliffs of Traprain Law.
That volcanic drop we just described.
Yeah, and hurled off the edge.
Now, obviously, the religious text frames the aftermath as divine intervention.
Right, the hagiography states she miraculously survives the fall, gets put in a tiny coracle boat on the Firth of Forth, washes ashore at Culross in Fife, and gives birth to St. Mungo.
But we have to apply our forensic reinterpretation here.
We have to translate this miracle into gritty political reality.
This is not a fairy tale about a princess surviving against all odds.
This was a calculated, incredibly brutal honor killing.
It is pure, ruthless statecraft. You have to view this event entirely through the lens of dynastic alliances and border control.
Because Ludonis is ruling the Votadini.
And Reged, where the father is from, is a massive, powerful rival kingdom to the southwest.
So an unsanctioned pregnancy completely destabilizes his line of succession.
Absolutely. That unborn child represents a future claimant to the territory of Lothian. It's a puppet that Reged could use to eventually annex Ludonis's lands.
And in a warlord society, showing weakness is a literal death sentence.
Ludonis executing his own daughter by throwing her off his volcanic capital is a public, terrifying display of absolute authority.
It's him screaming to his domestic rivals, "If I will do this to my own blood to protect my throne, imagine what I will do to your armies."
It is cartel behavior. It's the uncompromising pragmatism required to maintain control in a power vacuum.
But we need the physical receipts for this level of power. We need proof that this ruler of Dunpelter wasn't just a local thug commanding a few dozen spearmen.
Right. We need proof he was a sovereign capable of fielding an army large enough to rival a high king.
And that receipt actually exists. We have to talk about the sheer scale of the Traprain Law treasure.
This is where the dirt provides the ultimate, undeniable evidence. In 1919, an archaeological excavation led by Alexander Ormiston Curl decided to dig into the summit of Traprain Law.
And what they unearthed completely shattered our previous understanding of the sub-Roman North.
They found a hoard of Roman silver plate.
And we aren't talking about a few tarnished coins found in a rotting leather pouch either.
No.
We're talking about 24 kilograms of silver.
For 50 pounds of pure Roman silver. And this hoard included coins of the emperors Valens, Arcadius, and Honorius.
Which allows us to date the deposit precisely to the early 5th century.
Right at the violent, chaotic collapse of Roman Britain. But what is truly vital here, that tells the real story, is the actual condition of the silver.
It wasn't carefully stacked or preserved.
No, it was violently hacked to pieces.
Hacksilber. They took these beautiful, ornate, incredibly crafted Roman dishes and platters, and they just took a chisel and chopped them into jagged chunks.
Because the artistry meant absolutely nothing to them.
Only the weight mattered.
It was a bullion economy, the purest form of industrial pragmatism.
Let's expand on that concept of industrial pragmatism for a second, because the immediate instinct when people hear about a hoard of hacked-up silver is to assume it was just pirate booty.
Right. They picture Votadini warriors raiding a Roman villa down south.
Stealing the silverware, running back up to their rock, and chopping it up to divide the spoils.
Which is an entirely incorrect assumption.
Yeah.
That silver was not stolen. It was a salary.
A salary.
Yes. It was massive institutional diplomatic payment. This is what we call psychological scaffolding and geopolitical bribery.
Because Rome, even as it was collapsing, still had vast state wealth.
But they were losing the manpower to actually hold Hadrian's Wall, so they utilized mercenary subsidies.
They took the immense wealth of the state, boxed up these massive silver platters and literally shipped them north to the Bodadini kings.
Rome was intentionally paying Ludonus and his predecessors to act as a violent buffer state.
They were paying him to be the meat shield.
Precisely. The Romans essentially said, here is 50 pounds of silver. Take this, chop it up, use it to pay your subcommanders and your spearmen.
And in exchange, you make sure the picks from the highland and the angles from the sea do not cross your territory and bother us.
The sheer scale of 24 kilograms of silver is staggering for this era. It proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that the warlord, sitting on Traprain Law, possessed a massive, highly organized military force.
You don't give that much silver to a local thug.
No, you give it to a king who commands thousands of men.
And just think about the scale of that wealth, 24 kilograms of silver.
If you're tracking with us into the dirt of this investigation, pull up a permanent chair at the table, lock us in on your feet, and drop a rating.
Absolutely.
Because we haven't even touched the textual gerrymandering yet. Take us into how they tried to erase Lot.
It is infuriating when you realize the sheer scale of the historical theft that occurs next.
It really is.
If Lot, this prototype figure of Ludonus, was an immensely wealthy, geographically entrenched Lothian warlord sitting on a volcanic fortress with a mountain of Roman silver.
How did the later medieval legends turn him into the king of Orkney in Norway?
Exactly. How do you take a man, move him hundreds of miles north, completely off the mainland, and stick him on a boat?
We have to introduce the concept of textual gerrymandering. We've discussed this before regarding the conscious editorial scrubbing of northern historical figures.
By medieval chroniclers, right?
What we see in the later French texts, the Arthurian romances most people know, isn't just organic myth-making.
It's calculated textual gerrymandering designed to make Arthur fit a southern courtly narrative.
They deliberately stripped the northern identities from these warlords because a powerful, independent northern sovereign didn't fit the political propaganda of the Anglo-Norman courts in London and Paris.
So we need to map out how this theft actually happened. Let's trace the progression of this geographic exile.
It starts heavily with Geoffrey of Monmouth around 1136.
Geoffrey writes the Historia Regum Britannia, which essentially invents the pseudo-history of Britain, and he starts heavily tweaking the map.
He takes our Lothian warlord, who's been dead for 600 years, and turns him into a lot of Lodonesia and Norway.
Which is an absolutely wild leap, because in Geoffrey's own text, just a few pages over, he explicitly names a completely different guy, Gunnafasis, as the ruler of Orkney.
But Geoffrey plants the seed anyway. He gives Lot these massive trans-maritime claims.
He gives him a Scandinavian connection that never existed in reality.
And that Scandinavian connection is exactly where the linguistic collision happens, leading to complete identity theft.
The phonetic hijack.
Yes. The ancient Brythonic name Loth or Lot sounds incredibly similar to the Old Norse personal name Lot.
L-J-O-T, Lord.
Exactly. And Jot was a highly prominent, incredibly feared name within the historical Viking ruling class of Orkney.
Specifically, we're looking at the historical figure that the medieval writers used to completely overwrite our Lothian warlord.
Jarl-Jit Thorfinnsson.
I was looking into the historical rulers of Orkney during this time, and Jarl-Jot is a terrifying figure in his own right.
But completely disconnected from the Arthurian era.
Right. He's a 10th century Norse Jarl. He is the fourth son of Thorfinn's Skullsplitter.
And you do not get the moniker Skullsplitter by sitting in a castle reading poetry.
No, Jarl-Jot was a massive, brutal maritime warlord. His whole identity was tied to the sea. He defended the Orkney Islands from rival Viking factions and seized control of Caithness on the northern tip of the Scottish mainland.
And he eventually died from massive battle wounds fighting the native Scots at Skidmire.
So visualize this process for a second. You have these French Romance writers, centuries later, sitting in comfortable southern courts.
They read Geoffrey of Monmouth, who vaguely says Lot is connected to Norway.
They look at a crude map of the north, and they see the Orkney Islands sitting right there like stepping stones between Scotland and Norway.
And then they hear the local oral histories about these legendary Viking rulers of Orkney named Jot.
The phonetic similarities between King Lot and Jarl-Jot are just too much for them to ignore.
They mash the two figures together, completely overriding 500 years of history.
But why did Orkney specifically make so much sense to these continental writers? Like, why not just make him the king of Norway and be done with it?
It comes down to a very specific geopolitical reality of the High Middle Ages. Orkney had dual vassalage.
The strategic fix they needed.
Exactly. The Orkney Jarls operated in a highly contested, incredibly complex frontier zone. They owed direct, formal fealty to the Kingdom of Norway for the islands themselves, Orkney and Shetland.
But because they had expanded south, they also held extensive mainland territories in Scotland, like Caithness.
And for those mainland territories, they owed fealty to the Scottish crown. They literally had a foot in both kingdoms.
They were vassals to two different monarchs simultaneously.
So if you were a French writer trying to rationalize how King Lot could be a British king fighting Arthur in Lothian, but also somehow have legitimate claims to Norway,
Orkney is the perfect geographic bridge to make your fiction sound plausible.
you use that real-world dual vassalage of the Viking era to build a fictional, massive maritime empire for him in the Arthurian era.
You take a mud and stone Brythonic warlord who fought from the top of Traprain Law, and you turn him into a pan-northern maritime king commanding fleets of Viking longships.
It is a complete systemic overriding of his actual historical context. And the tragedy is that it didn't just happen to his geography, it happened to his entire family through linguistic devolution.
Right, because the Norman writers struggled heavily with Brythonic pronunciation.
It sounded alien and harsh to them. So when they translated these tales, they systematically changed Celtic W sounds to G sounds to make them more palatable for a French-speaking audience.
So the ancient, rugged Welsh hero Gorvan gets completely fractured, scrubbed of his Celtic identity, and rewritten into the chivalric Arthurian knight Gerrymandering.
Gwalhwyd, a hero of the Old North, devolves into Gareth.
They stripped away the Celtic roots, scrubbed the language, and manufactured this tragic, courtly Orkney clan that fit perfectly into their chivalric soap operas.
Completely divorcing them from the violent sub-Roman reality of the Votadini.
It reminds me of a massive historical game of telephone.
How so?
Well, imagine a fiercely independent 19th century Texas Ranger. He fights in the dust. He knows the southern border topography intimately. His whole identity is tied to the blistering heat and the specific politics of the Mexican border.
Okay, I'm tracking.
And then, 100 years later, some writers in Paris hear a name that vaguely rhymes with his. Because they don't care about the geography, they completely erase his Texan identity and merge him with a Canadian maritime smuggler operating out of Nova Scotia.
Oh, wow.
Suddenly, future generations understand this desert lawman as a guy who fights on icebreakers in the freezing Atlantic just because their names sounded similar.
It completely alters how you understand their actual battle.
Their tactics, their geopolitical reality, you just lose the essence of the man.
That analogy is spot on. And I want to emphasize the friction here. This was not a harmless accident. This wasn't a simple translation error by a sleepy monk.
It was weaponized folklore.
The Southern Anglo-Norman courts were actively trying to assert military and political dominance over Scotland during the Middle Ages.
So by severing Arthur's greatest, most legitimate rival from the physical Scottish landscape of Lothian,
And exiling him to the remote semi-Scandinavian islands of Orkney, they politically neutered the historical memory of a powerful, independent southern Scottish kingdom.
they erased the threat from their own borders.
They turned a domestic rival into a foreign, exotic maritime villain.
They really tried to erase him. They threw every textual weapon they had at him, but the physical landscape of Lothian held onto his bones.
And this is where we get back to the physical receipts.
Yes, you demanded we return to the dirt of East Lothian, and the dirt absolutely delivers. We have to look at the physical markers left behind.
Let's go back to that Vita Kentigerney account of Ludonus's death.
The hagiography states that after he ordered his daughter thrown from the cliff at Dunpelder, the local politics violently fractured.
Tenia's supporters, outraged by the brutal honor killing, rebelled.
They pursued Ludonus, cornered him, and killed him near the base of Traprain Law.
And the medieval records specifically note that a great royal stone was erected at the site to mark his grave and commemorate his fall.
And this is where the landscape forensics get incredibly compelling. Because just a short distance southwest of Traprain Law, sitting out in a field, there is a monument.
Locally known as the Lothstone.
Right. It is an 8-foot-high, 4-sided standing monolith. It is imposing, it is heavily weathered by centuries of Scottish rain, and it looks incredibly ancient.
But here's the critical twist. Modern archaeologists have securely dated the Lothstone.
It wasn't erected in the 5th century to mark a warlord's grave.
No, it dates back to roughly 2000 BC.
It is a Bronze Age, prehistoric monolith.
And this is a perfect textbook example of psychological scaffolding.
Let's break that concept down for the listener because it explains so much about how these warlords operated.
Psychological scaffolding is when a newer emerging power occupies or utilizes the monumental architecture of a previous, vastly more ancient power to borrow their ghost.
To borrow their inherent legitimacy.
Exactly. We saw it when sub-Roman warlords built their timber halls directly inside the crumbling stone walls of abandoned Roman forts.
They didn't build there just for the defensive walls. They built there to physically link themselves to the memory of the Roman Empire.
Precisely. The local medieval populations of Lothian took the oral traditions and the violent death of their 5th century king Ludonus and retroactively mapped his story onto a 2,000-year-old pagan standing stone.
They didn't have the manpower or the resources to quarry and carve a massive new monument.
So they anchored their local hero to those dominant, ancient, mysterious piece of stone in their landscape to give his memory eternal gravity.
By claiming that ancient stone as his grave, they were basically saying, our king's power is as old and immovable as the earth itself.
But the landscape forensics get even stranger, and this is where the timeline really collides.
Right, because just a very short distance away from the Lothstone is the Morham Parish Church.
And during structural investigations of the church wall, archaeologists made a startling discovery.
Built right into the masonry, reused as basic building material by later generations, was a broken, highly ornate piece of an Anglo-Saxon cross shaft.
And the carvings on this specific cross shaft are incredibly telling about the cultural collision happening in Lothian.
It features traditional Christian vine scrolls, which is a very standard Anglo-Saxon motif.
It has carvings of quadrupeds, animals biting at their own tails.
But right alongside those traditional Christian motifs, it has a carving of a grotesque creature with protuberant eyes.
What historians classify as a classic Pictish, goggle-eyed beast.
And scholars have developed a compelling architectural theory about this piece of stone. They suggest it wasn't just a standard freestanding vertical cross that stood in a graveyard.
Based on the way it's carved, they believe it was originally designed as a horizontal frieze.
They argue it was a massive stone bridge meant to physically connect and span the gap between the prehistoric Lothstone we just talked about and another ancient monolith located nearby at Standing Stone Farm.
I want to stop and just analyze the sheer visual weight of that imagery.
Right.
Try to visualize what you were describing, because it sounds almost absurd on the surface.
It really does.
You have a towering, weathered Bronze Age pagan standing stone erected in 2000 BC. You have a Christian Anglo-Saxon frieze carved hundreds of years later.
And on that supposedly Christian frieze, you have the carving of a pagan Pictish monster.
How can all of these violently conflicting eras, religions, and cultures possibly exist as one cohesive monument dedicated to the memory of a sub-Roman warlord?
It seems like a chaotic, contradictory mess.
Why wouldn't the Christians just tear down the pagan stone? Why wouldn't the Anglo-Saxons smash the Pictish carvings?
You have three totally different worldviews mashed together in one pile of rocks.
It seems chaotic until you apply the geopolitical lens of the era. Then it becomes the ultimate physical proof of a cultural borderland.
Lothian was the absolute front line of Britain.
It was the exact geographic point where the Brittonic Cadaudan met the fierce northern Picts pushing down, and where the southern Anglo-Saxons were relentlessly pushing upward.
So this hybrid monument isn't a mess. It is a deliberate, forceful stitching together of pagan, Pictish, and Christian identities.
It is the landscape literally absorbing every single cultural influence thrown at it to anchor the memory of King Lot.
They were creating a physical, unmovable boundary marker against the encroaching South.
The monument was saying, we possess the ancient magic of the stones, the new power of the Christian cross, and the ferocity of the Pictish beasts, and we stand united here against you.
It is the land itself resisting the textual gerrymandering of the French writers.
And that brings us directly to the fierce medieval propaganda war over King Lot's legacy.
Because once the French and English writers realized they couldn't entirely erase him from the map because his name was too deeply embedded in the geography of Lothian, they pivoted their strategy.
If they couldn't erase him, they would slander him.
They turned the historical reality of his brutal, pragmatic warfare into a narrative of Southern chivalry versus Northern savagery.
The Southern slander is incredibly aggressive, and it reveals a deep-seated anxiety about the North.
In the English and French chivalric romances, Lot is heavily marginalized.
They are forced to acknowledge he holds massive power. They place him holding court at Dyn Eiton,
The formidable castle rock of modern Edinburgh.
which the romances sometimes refer to as Mount And or the Castle of Maidens.
But despite recognizing the impregnability of his stronghold, the Southern writers treat him with deep ingrained prejudice.
They depict him as a boorish, highly suspicious, untrustworthy sovereign.
They frame him as a barbaric northern warlord who has merely, and I quote the romances here, washed the woad from his skin.
I want to highlight that specific phrase for you listening because it carries immense cultural weight.
Woad was the dark blue dye that the ancient Britons and the Picts historically used to paint themselves for battle.
It was meant to terrify the Romans.
So saying he just washed the woad from his skin is a massive, calculated medieval insult.
Is the southern courts looking at Lot and saying, he might wear a crown, he might sit in a castle, he might have a hoard of Roman silver, but underneath it all, he is just an uncivilized, naked savage from the mud of the north pretending to be a king.
It is pure imperial condescension.
It is an attempt to delegitimize his right to rule. But let's look at how he actually operated on the battlefield, because the historical data, even the incredibly biased southern narratives, cannot fully hide his military brilliance.
Look at his depiction as the rebel general at the massive Battle of Bedegrain.
This is a critical engagement in the Arthurian timeline. A young, newly crowned King Arthur is trying to consolidate his power across Britain.
And Lot organizes a massive coalition of 11 rebel kings to stop him. He raises a massive army.
During the climax of the battle, Arthur launches a devastating, relentless cavalry charge against the rebel forces.
And here is where Lot's tactical genius and his sheer, terrifying pragmatism really shines through.
Lot observes the battlefield from the high ground. He sees that his infantry, the peasant footmen holding spears and shields, are slowing down the retreat.
The mud is thick, the lines are breaking.
The infantry is bogged down, and the entire rebel army is at risk of being flanked and utterly slaughtered by Arthur's highly mobile horsemen.
So what does Lot do? He doesn't order a glorious, heroic last stand where everyone dies together.
He commands the rebel kings to deliberately abandon their infantry.
He tells them to leave the footmen to be slaughtered in the woods, while he unites all the surviving horsemen into a tight, disciplined cavalry block that violently smashes its way to safety.
I really want to emphasize the visceral horror of this specific moment.
It is the absolute definition of what we call the meat grinder tactic.
There is zero shining chivalry here. There are no honorable speeches about brotherhood and loyalty.
Think about what that actually means on the ground. You are a foot soldier, knee-deep in mud, terrified, holding the line against armored cavalry.
You look back, expecting reinforcements?
And you see your own king, the man you swore an oath to, deliberately riding away and leaving you to die, just to buy himself time.
It is purely mathematical, brutal warfare. Lot calculates that the infantry is dead weight.
He coldly sacrifices thousands of his own men to the slaughter to save his elite strike force.
It is horrific, but from a sub-Roman tactical perspective, it is brilliant. It ensures the core of his army survives to fight another day.
It is the action of a seasoned dux bellorum who intimately understands the seasonal, muddy reality of a war of attrition.
He knows that peasants can be replaced, but trained war horses and heavy cavalry cannot.
But of course, the southern romances couldn't let the rebel general win using brutal logic.
His rebellion is eventually broken, leading to his tragic end at the Battle of Terrible Castle.
And again, it is very telling how the southern writers dispatch him. They have to resort to literal magic to defeat him.
Merlin uses his magical arts to distract Lot with rhetoric, creating illusions that keep Lot out of the main clash until his allies are destroyed.
Realizing the deception too late, Lot charges into the fray alone and is slain by King Pellinore.
It is a highly convenient way for the southern narrative to eliminate the northern threat without having Arthur defeat him in a fair fight.
But the Scottish chroniclers weren't going to let that slander stand unchallenged.
This is where we see the massive Scottish reclamation of King Lot.
In the 14th and 16th centuries, Scottish historians look at these Arthurian legends being propagated by the South.
And they realize they are dealing with highly weaponized English imperial propaganda designed specifically to justify English overlordship of Scotland.
So they fight back by completely rewriting the geopolitical alignment.
John of Fordun, writing in the late 1300s, launches the historical counteroffensive.
He ignores the French romances entirely. He claims that Lot was descended directly from the ancient British king Fulgentius.
This is a vital tactical move in the realm of propaganda because it establishes a senior, vastly more ancient and far more legitimate royal bloodline for Lot than anything Arthur possesses.
And then Hector Bus, writing later in 1527, takes it even further. Bus casts King Lot not as a rebellious warlord, but as a legitimate native Pictish monarch.
In this Scottish counter-narrative, Lot isn't a rebel at all.
He is the true, lawful heir to the entirety of Britain because he's married to Arthur's aunt, or in some versions, his sister, carrying the absolute legitimate royal bloodline.
The geopolitical reversal here is absolute genius.
Right.
By elevating Lot's bloodline and tying him to the ancient kings of the island, the Scottish chroniclers cast King Arthur as the ultimate villain.
Arthur is framed not as a shining beacon of chivalry, but as an illegitimate bastard southern usurper who seized the crown through brute military force and dark magic.
Think about the scale of this propaganda war for a second. Put yourself in the shoes of a Scot reading Fordin or Boece in the 1500s.
For them, Lot's massive rebellion at Bedegraine wasn't treason against a high king.
It was a desperate, fiercely patriotic defense of the North.
It was a sovereign nation fighting against English imperial expansionism that was dressed up and disguised as Arthurian chivalry.
Lot wasn't the bad guy. He was the resistance.
He was the only thing standing between Scottish independence and southern domination.
It perfectly illustrates how these narratives were weaponized generation after generation. The physical landscape of Lothian, the massive hoard of Roman silver, the tactical, bloody realities of the meat grinder at Bedegraine.
They were all drafted into a centuries-long, deeply bitter war over national sovereignty.
Which brings all these geopolitical and forensic threads together and forces us to fundamentally recontextualize the entire fall of Arthur's empire.
Because when you strip away the magic, when you remove the Holy Grail and the curses, a chilling realization emerges about why Camelot truly fell.
The apocalyptic collapse of Arthur's kingdom at the Battle of Camelot was not the result of fate or divine punishment.
It was destroyed by a gritty, multi-generational tribal blood feud born directly in the sub-Roman north.
The math of the blood feud is undeniable. Because Pellinore killed Lot at the Battle of Terrible, Lot's sons, the Orkney brothers, Gawain, Agravain, Gaheris, they didn't forgive.
And they certainly didn't forget.
They were raised in the violent traditions of the North. They systematically hunted down Pellinore's entire family.
They murdered Pellinore in revenge. And eventually, they cornered his son, the great Sir Lamorak, and brutally stabbed him in the back in a wildly unfair fight.
The legendary Round Table wasn't broken by magical spells or a crisis of faith.
It was shattered from the inside by the harsh, unforgiving marcher traditions of King Loth's northern lineage.
They brought a culture that demanded blood for blood, an eye for an eye, straight into the heart of Arthur's court.
Violently tearing the kingdom apart until it literally drowned in its own civil war.
It all traces back to the dirt and the volcanic rock of Lothian.
From the ancient woods of Celadon to the battlements of Mount Aned, and now to the lands of Lot and Lothian, the map of the historic Arthur is rewriting itself. The further we dig into the earliest roots of the legend, the clearer it becomes. The only names and places we can confidently ground in reality all share the same rugged landscape. King Arthur's kingdom wasn't born in the sunny south. Its true home lies in what we know today as Scotland. Until next time, keep searching the mists.
That truly is the crux of it all. Thank you so much for sticking with us through the dirt, the stone, and the sheer geopolitical weight of this exploration.
Unpacking the reality behind the myth is never clean, but having you at the table with us makes the extraction process worth every minute.
Absolutely. The level of forensic tracking we're applying here relies on a community that actually wants the unvarnished truth, not just the polished fairy tale.
We are so fired up to keep pushing this investigation forward. The map of the North is wide open now, and the evidence we are lining up for the next episode is going to hit even harder.
We were just getting started with the Northern Evidence Arc. There is so much more ground to cover and so many more receipts to pull from the soil. Keep questioning the established narrative. We'll see you in the next one.